I spoke extensively with Nobel Prize winner Josh Angrist about the question of excellence in academia. On the sidelines of those conversations, a research finding came up that caught my attention. Professor Angrist called this the elitist illusion. We all think that if we get accepted to Harvard, we will learn much more than we will learn at another university. But according to Professor Angrist, this is probably an illusion. You might prefer Boston's weather to other places. You might also want to make your parents happy. But if we measure learning and income post-graduation, it turns out that there is no significant difference where we study. So in the fifth conversation in this series with the economics Nobelist, Professor Josh Angrist, he explains what the illusion of elitism is. If you're interested, you should find the article at the beginning of his reply. So here is Professor Angrist and the illusion of elitism.
Well, I've written about a phenomenon that my colleagues and I call the elite illusion. And that comes up in many settings, but the original setting for that is the question of whether it's important for students to go to selective institutions. So in higher education, do you learn more and you end up with a better career and higher earnings because you went to a highly selective university? So in the American context, you might say, well, is it worth going to MIT? And it's certainly costly. So it's worth asking whether it's worth it, because the tuition is $60,000 a year and the living expenses are high. And most Americans could go to a very inexpensive public university, which won't be as selective. The students will not be as kind of top in terms of how they look when they come in, but it'll be much cheaper, in some cases free. So is there a return to elite higher education? That's one version of the question. Another version, again, thinking about the American context, though you also have this in Israel, some of our high schools are very selective. So most Americans go to public schools, which enroll anybody in the city. And when the seats are oversubscribed, when there's excess demand, they use some version of a lottery to decide who gets to go. But there are a few very well-known schools that are very selective. So these are schools like Boston Latin School, which is the oldest high school in the country. That's a very selective public school in Boston. New York City, you have Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science. In Washington, D.C., you have Thomas Jefferson High School. In Chicago, there's a dozen or so exam schools, including famous schools like Peyton and Northside. And those are schools that are very hard to get into. And parents look at that, and some students, and they say, oh my God, look at all the famous, successful people that went to that school. That must be a good school. I want my child to go to that school. The elite illusion is an alternative interpretation of that, which is that the people who went to the Boston Latin School are more successful on average than other public school students because only those who are likely to succeed get in. It's a selective school. So only if you have very high test scores and very good grades can you get into Boston Latin School, because it's an exam school. You have to pass a test to get in. And so maybe what we're finding out is that the type of person who goes to the Boston Latin School, or for that matter, MIT, because it's the same. You only get into MIT if your test scores are high enough in high school and your grades are good enough in high school, and also you come from a family that can afford for you to go to MIT. Even though you might get some financial aid, there's still going to be a cost. So we might be finding out that there's a selection process that favors people who are likely to succeed anyway, and that the actual causal effect of going to one of these schools is not very big, maybe even zero or negative. Now, I always explain to my students there would be, in principle, there's a straightforward way to answer this question about whether it's worth going to MIT. But we could run a randomized trial where we, instead of going through this elaborate interview and testing process, we could take some students and just admit them randomly. Maybe we wouldn't tell them that it was done this way. And then we follow everybody and see how their lives come out. And same thing for the exam schools. We could run experiments that answer the question of whether these are good schools, in the sense of actually making people learn more and giving them, in the case of high school, making them more likely to go to college and eventually earn more. Well, we study those kind of questions. So in our lab, we were one of the first group of scholars to study the actual effect of going to exam schools, high schools. Israel has versions of this, like the Liada school near Givat Ram in Jerusalem is an exam school in the American sense. So you don't have, of course, a real randomized trial here, but you can use something called a regression discontinuity design, which is one of the econometric methods that I use. Frequently, it's described in my books. And you essentially look at people who are sort of very close to the cutoff for getting in. And the people who just barely make it are very similar to the people who don't quite make it. So you see that the people who barely make it, they end up going to exam schools. They have much higher achieving peers, but they don't actually have better outcomes later. They don't learn more, at least not as measured by their test scores. They're not more likely to go to four-year colleges. They don't go to more selective colleges. So it doesn't look like the exam schools actually produce learning gains. So that's what we call the elite illusion. A sort of naive comparison of people who go to this school or that school. If you went to a more selective school, you do better. When I was teaching this week, I described to my students, and there is apparently research on this by Bank of Israel. They've looked at graduates of schools like Tel Aviv and Hebrew University that are very selective and compared the earnings of those people with the earnings of people who go to michlalot that aren't very selective. And the people who go to the research universities, the selective research universities, indeed earn more. But that might just be because it's only that type of person who can get in. So we'd like to have a good natural experiment for whether you go to Tel Aviv, Hebrew, and Technion. And we'd find out if there's really value added there. In the US, you have the issue of, is it worth paying for a private university education? And the answer for a lot of people might be that it's not.
It's an illusion.
Yeah. Now, you might want to do it for other reasons. It makes your mother and father proud. You know, socially, you might enjoy it more. But from the point of view of learning, getting the most human capital out of your college experience, it's not clear that the elite paths are worth it. You know, at some level, there is a payoff. So it gets a little more complicated as you move down. So, you know, MIT is super elite. At the other end of the scale, there are non-selective two-year colleges. Almost certainly, it's better to go to a four-year college than a two-year college. So there, the four-year schools are better than the two-year schools. The four-year schools,
2 years?
not only. They tend to get their students to graduate at a much higher rate. They're probably, on average, higher quality institutions. So there it really does matter. But it's not so much because of the selectivity. There's something else about the organization of the program.